So it's a big moment for us, starting chapter 12 of Tanya. The reason I say that it's a big moment for us, not because we can now pat ourselves on the back and say we have completed 11 chapters and we started the 12th chapter, but because this is where we're going to begin to address some of the questions that we raised at the beginning of our Tanya journey. So for that reason, it's probably a good idea for us to remind ourselves of some of those questions. How did we get here? What stimulated the conversation of Tanya? And that's going to direct us to understanding where we're going with this chapter and the next few chapters that follow. Right at the beginning of Tanya, in the first chapter, the Alter Rebbe, the author of the Tanya, quoted, if you want the page, it's page 48, but that's assuming that we're actually going to start reading immediately, which we may not. So in the beginning of Tanya, the Alter Rebbe quoted two Talmudic sources. The first is a section in the Gemara Nida that says, before a neshama, before a soul enters this world, they make you take an oath, tehi tzaddik ve'al tehi rasha. Swear that you will be a tzaddik, and equally that you will not be a rasha. Now, at that point in time, when we began to study Tanya, we still thought that life was simple. The tzaddikim are the good guys, the rashayim are the bad guys. So if it's telling us to be a tzaddik, it's basically saying be a decent human being, or as many people like to say, the most important thing is to be a mensch. And al tehi rasha, don't be a criminal. That's effectively what it sounds like, and it's not altogether different than from the advice that many parents give to their children. Be a decent human being, stay out of trouble. Then, however, we saw that there is another Talmudic reference from Pirkei Avos, from the Ethics of the Fathers, and that says, Al tehi rasha b'fnei atzmecha. You should never assume yourself to be a rasha. So the Gemara was saying that you should swear to be a tzaddik and not to be wicked, and even if the whole world tells you that you are a tzaddik, always view yourself ke rasha, as if you were wicked. And then we had this other quotation that says, never see yourself as being wicked. So which one is it? When you look in the mirror, who are you supposed to see? Are you supposed to see a tzaddik? Wow, amazing, I'm an incredible human being with a glowing soul. Or are you supposed to say, ke rasha? You know what? You've got to see yourself as a rogue, you're not nearly where you need to be. Which one is it? To solve that query, the Alter Rebbe introduced us to another Talmudic source, which says that there are actually 5 general categories of Jewish people, which is effectively 5 general categories of how we understand our spiritual development. One is called the perfect tzaddik, one is called the imperfect tzaddik, one is called the complete rasha, one is called the incomplete rasha, and then there is something called a Beinoni, which up until today has been the most elusive category of spiritual development that exists. Because in chapter 10, we discussed what tzaddik is, the 2 types of tzaddik. And we said that a perfect tzaddik is an individual who not only is able to rid themselves of any negative behavior, but they're able to convert whatever was once part of them, part of their toxic reality. They're actually now able to convert it and turn it into something which is meaningful and healthy and holy and positive. And then the tzaddik, that's an incomplete tzaddik, is an incredible human being who lives at a very, very developed spiritual level, but the toxic elements of their personality have just been quashed and quelled. They haven't been transformed into something positive. So the way to identify a perfect tzaddik is their inability to tolerate something that interferes with Hashem in this world. And so they will not rest until they make a difference. They will not rest until they spin it around and turn what was very objectionable into something which is very healthy and positive. Whereas the imperfect tzaddik is maybe not campaigning to change the whole world. As long as they're in a healthy place and their community is in a healthy place, that's actually good enough for them. Then we got to chapter 11, and there we discovered what the 2 kinds of rasha are. And in fact, we said, because the rasha is a little bit closer to home, so we needed a little bit more information about the rasha, even though it's a very short chapter, and the Alter Rebbe kind of glossed over it in a certain sense. Not glossed over what a rasha is, but didn't really take us, through every little detail. He just told us there's a spectrum, and what we need to know is the spectrum of rasha is how much a person disobeys what Hashem wants, how badly it is, in other words, the things that they choose to do, which is contrary to Hashem's will, how severe, how serious those particular choices are, how frequently it happens, that is what determines the state of a Rasha. And right at the end of the chapter, we said, and you know what, there might even be somebody who is so bad, what we're calling the absolute Rasha, who is so engaged in toxic behavior that they actually push their own neshama out of their consciousness. So the neshama obviously is always there, but they're just totally out of touch with their own neshama. So we know now what the two kinds of tzaddik are. And we know now what the two kinds of Rasha are. The most mysterious category, which is the one that lies in the middle, is the Beinoni. Right at the beginning, in the first chapter, we already established that a Beinoni cannot be somebody who goes against what Hashem wants. And the reason that we were so clear about that is because, as we've just seen from chapter 11, if a person does something contrary to what Hashem wants, even if it's once, even if it's lightweight, even if it's not an earth-shattering sin, the fact is, when a person does something contrary to what Hashem wants, that person falls into the world of the Rasha. And they stay in that world until they do teshuvah. So the first line of chapter 12, which is going to introduce us to the Beinoni, should not come as such a surprise against that background, because we now know the definition of a Rasha is you doing something which is against what Hashem wants. It doesn't matter if it is a cardinal sin or if it's something minor. That's just the spectrum of the Rasha. But the title Rasha applies to any person at any time doing anything which is not aligned with what Hashem wants. In which case, if it didn't hit us square between the eyes in the last chapter, it will become pretty apparent in this chapter. Welcome to the club. We are all part of the Rasha reality. Not because we're bad people, not because we're wicked, not because we're rebels, because the fact is we do things we're not supposed to do. And if you are not in the Rasha club, well, then maybe you're at the wrong shir, and you should be going to the advanced class for people who are very, very spiritually developed. But for the rest of us, we know how it is. We let ourselves down sometimes. Not often, obviously. Not in serious ways, obviously. But we do occasionally let ourselves down. Okay, so that's the framing introduction to this chapter. Now, here's the thing. As we go through this chapter, and we begin to completely reinvent the definition of a Beinoni, because the average, excuse the pun, person believes that a Beinoni is the average person. Meaning, the average person understands that what Beinoni means is, sometimes I'm good, sometimes I'm not so good. Effectively, the person who's doing their best. That's how most of us typically understand the Beinoni. We're going to discover that that's not the case. So as we develop the Beinoni, what's going to emerge is, this is what the book of Tanya, or at least the first 53 chapters of the book, this is what it's really about. It's about this personality. It's about this character called the Beinoni. And from two perspectives. And we've got to keep these two perspectives in mind as we go through Tanya. Primarily, this is Sefer Shel Beinonim. This is a guidebook for the Beinoni, and you'll see many times what the Alter Rebbe says is addressed to somebody who is already at this level of Beinoni, telling them what they should be doing, what they should be conscious of, what they should be wary of, so they can keep themselves where they need to be spiritually. And simultaneously, the Alter Rebbe is pretty much developing an aspiration for us. The Beinoni is who we should want to become. So, the not so good news is, if you always lived with the aspiration to become a tzaddik, as of today, that is no longer on the agenda. That doesn't mean that you can't become a tzaddik. It's just not the aspiration. We've got to first aspire to become a Beinoni. Or as Hasidim used to say, the expression they used to use was, Halevai a Beinoni. I wish I were a Beinoni. That's got to be our aspiration. We should never limit ourselves. We should never say it's impossible to be a tzaddik. Gesund to hate. A dream about being a tzaddik, and that's fine. But our practical aspiration is to be a Beinoni. So to put that into context, if somebody came along and said, my aspiration in life is to have a successful business, we'll say that's wonderful. It's a good aspiration to have. Now get down to doing it. If you want to have a great, successful business, well, there's certain steps that you have to take. Come up with a business plan, find investors, get the right kind of team around you, have a clear vision, and then you can go out and you can actually try to become the most successful business person, and that's absolutely fine. But if somebody were to come along and say, I would like to become an Olympic athlete, but it so happens that the person is 40 years or older, we're going to say to the person, sorry, it's no longer a valid aspiration. Nobody's looking at you for the team if you're older than 40 years old, or probably even older than 30 years old. So it's not, that wouldn't be a useful aspiration. So you want to have the dream, and maybe because you're aiming to be an Olympic athlete, you'll actually land up doing exercise, because at date, if that's going to get you to do exercise, that's a great thing. If a person is motivated to be a tzaddik, and that's going to get them to do more in their Yiddishkeit, that's great. But if a person is going to buy into the belief that I am cut out to be a tzaddik, and that effectively, if I'm not a tzaddik, I'm letting myself down, that is counterproductive. Because the tzaddik, as we already learned in the first chapter, is a rare commodity. Extremely rare. But more importantly for us, it's not even our purpose most of the time. Beinoni, as we understand what a Beinoni is, we're going to discover that there is tremendous growth within the aspiration to a Beinoni. So, let's reinterpret the word. Instead of calling the Beinoni the average person, let's reframe the Beinoni as the ultimate state of the average person. So if we got to where we were supposed to be, we would be Beinonim. With that introduction, let's have a look how the chapter begins. Chapter 12, which is the chapter that describes the Beinoni, and then thereafter we go into the subsequent chapters that discuss what the Beinoni should be doing. Yud Beis, Perek Yud Beis, Veha Beinoni. What is the definition of a Beinoni? Who? The definition of a Beinoni is somebody shelo oilom ein hora goiver kol kach. The definition of a Beinoni is somebody who is never in a situation where their toxic side becomes so empowered, lichvoish es ha'ir ketana, to the extent that it could completely take over the miniature city. So in chapter 9, we said that you have to imagine the battle between the godly and the animal soul as the battle of two kings who want control of a small city. So if the negative gets control of the city becomes an evil place. If the positive gets control of the city becomes a beautiful place with values and morals and higher ideals. So the Beinoni is somebody who never surrenders that city. So that's our first perspective on the Beinoni. The Beinoni never surrenders the city. What does that mean? What does it mean to never surrender the city? Lehislabish v'guf, to allow the toxic side of oneself to actually become invested in my body, which effectively is myself. Lehachtioi, to allow me to sin. This is our first shocking piece of information. But it shouldn't be so shocking based on the information we already know. Because we already know that the definition of a Rasha is somebody behaving contrary to what Hashem wants, even in the short term, even at a so-called low-grade level of rebellion. So if that's what it takes to become a Rasha, then a Beinoni obviously is not doing those things. Otherwise, why would it be a different category of person? So let's understand this for a second. Does a Beinoni break Shabbos or eat non-kosher? Obviously not, because those are very significant rules of Judaism. And if a person is breaking Shabbos or eating non-kosher, they obviously fall into the category of Rasha, which means somebody who is defying what Hashem wants. But does a Beinoni consciously pick up a pen on Shabbos, even not writing, just picking up a pen and moving it from point A to point B? No, because that's also in defiance of what Hashem wants. Yes, it's only a rabbinic law, so therefore you'll say it's not so serious, and it's only to prevent us, so we don't actually break the laws of Shabbos by writing, so if you don't touch the pen, you'll never write. Surely it's not such a bad thing. You're right, it's not such a bad thing, and it's not aligned with what Hashem wants. And the definition of a rasha is a person doing something consciously that is not aligned with what Hashem wants. So the definition of a Beinoni then is, doesn't ever allow that to happen. Doesn't allow the negative to conquer the self, lehachtiyoi, to actually allow or cause the person to do something contrary to what Hashem wants. Dahainu, let's unpack what that means. That means, sheshloisha levushay nefesh abahamis. Now, in chapter 4, we introduced the idea that the soul has garments. And we explained at that point that the purpose of a garment is that it allows you a healthy interaction with the world around you. So certain types of garments are there to protect us, so that when we go out into the elements, we are not hurt by the elements. So somebody in our shul just came back from the UK and he was joking. I don't know if this is true or not, because I know we have some people on the Zoom who are from the UK, so you can verify. But he was joking that they warned that there was a heat wave. There was a heat wave coming in London this week. And what was the heat wave? 25 degrees Celsius. So needless to say, those of us in Africa were thinking that's pretty much our winter. So the joke is you've got to pull out all the protective gear, because that's one of the roles of garments, is to protect us from the elements, to protect us from the environment. Another role of garments is to allow us to interact with other people. So you know that it's a very uncomfortable experience if you arrive at somebody's house and they were not expecting you and they're not properly dressed. You know, they're running around in their bathrobe or something like that. It's not a comfortable experience. It doesn't allow us to interact properly. If a person walks into a board meeting of their public company in their shorts, we're going to say, hey, hang on a second, there's not a Zoom. You remember, like in Zoom time, you could do those things because people only cared about what you were wearing from the waist up. But this is a board meeting. You can't walk in like that. So the idea of garments is it allows us appropriate interaction between ourselves and the world that is around us. So the garments of the soul, therefore, are what we call thought and speech and action, because that's what allows the soul to engage with the world out there. What we don't necessarily think of, and this is what the Alter Rebbe is illustrating to us or reminding us of over here, is that the Nefesh HaBahamis, the animal soul, also has to have garments in order to interact with the world. Because as much as it is an animal, it is still a soul. In other words, it's a spiritual component of who we are. Nobody is walking around, well, I've got to be careful in today's world to say nobody, but nobody's walking around growling, right? Because it's not an animal, it's an animal version of the soul. So it's a spiritual entity that does not have a natural interface with the world, and it also needs thought, speech, and action. The reality of the human being is that our thoughts or our speech or our action are only available to one of the souls at a time. It's like this meeting room is unavailable. You know, it's being used by somebody else. So when we're talking over here about losing control of that miniature city, which is ourselves, where's that going to play out? Where you're going to see it? You're going to see it in thought, in speech, and in action. That's where it's going to begin. So the Beinoni doesn't have this experience of losing control of thought or speech or action. Now, at this point, you may have a very serious question to ask. I get it. You want to tell me that this is an individual who has the capacity to control their behavior. I get that. People can control their behavior. In fact, not only can we control our behavior, we are expected to control our behavior. People who have impulse control problems need help. It's an expectation of a developed human being to be able to control our behavior. Maybe we don't get 10 out of 10. Maybe we don't get it right all of the time. But that's why we feel guilty. That's why we grow. That's why we train. That's why we learn, because we accept that we must be able to control or redirect our behavior. So if you tell me that the Beinoni is somebody who's got their behavior down pat and they have this really strong impulse control and they don't go out there just doing things which are against the Torah, I get that. And the truth of the matter is you could even say the same for speech. Because we are all capable. I'm not saying that it is common, unfortunately, because many people don't work on themselves. But we're all capable of guarding our mouths. The Gemara says that Hashem designed the tongue with 2 layers of security, teeth and lips. So that any time that the tongue is about to get out of control, you can shut it down with these 2 layers of security. It's like two-factor authentication, to be able to speak. That means that we are absolutely capable of controlling our mouths. I'm not saying we do it, but we're capable of it. And we do it occasionally. How many times do we have something that we're about to say and then we think, you know what, that's probably not a good idea. It's going to hurt the other person. It's going to expose myself. It's not true. It's just Lashon Hara, whatever the reason is. And we shut it down. So when we're told that the Beinoni is consistent in control of behavior and in control of speech, while we would have tremendous respect for such a person and would put them on a pedestal, we could see it as being accessible. But the Alter Rebbe has said all 3 garments, that the Beinoni has control over all 3 garments. And it sounds far-fetched to imagine that anybody can control their thoughts. So we're going to have to unpack that. Not immediately, but it will emerge in the course of this conversation. We'll have to, or in the course of this chapter, we'll have to unpack this idea of what goes on in the thought world of the Beinoni. Because I don't know about you, and I've never had the experience of being a Beinoni, but I know that when I, for example, open the Siddur, it's an automatic release of the greatest mind creativity of the whole day. So dafka, when you're supposed to focus, you start davening, and you remember everything that you're supposed to do, and you come up with all the solutions for the world's problems, the greatest ideas of how you could grow your business, or in my case, new programs that I could do with the community. Most of those ideas out of the whole davening tend to express themselves during the Amidah. And out of the Amidahs, it's usually on Shabbos. So that by the time Shabbos is over, the ideas are lost and the frustration is through the roof. Now you're telling me that the Beinoni doesn't have this problem? We all have this problem. This is how we roll. This is the Jewish way. That's why I really believe if the Israeli government were all frum, they would have solved Israel's problems long ago, because they would daven every single day, and then in the davening they would have all the solutions. Because that's what happens to us. We can work anything out during the course of our davening. So you're telling me that debating, I know what it's like, and as we all know what it's like, to have invasive thoughts, inappropriate thoughts, fleeting thoughts. Now you're telling me that the Beinoni can control that? I need to understand this. I need to meet one of these people. How does this work? So we're going to have to unpack that. It's a very important part of the conversation. But we're not there yet, because we're still right at the beginning of the overall description of what the Beinoni avoids absolutely at all costs, le'olam, which is a very strong word, always. So I'm just running through it again. So the Beinoni does not allow these negative currents to take any control of the body, b'moyach, not in the brain, over peh, not in the mouth, of a shar ramach evarim, and not in any of the other 248 limbs of the body. So we're doing a connect the dots over here between thought and the organ called the brain, between speech and the organ of the mouth, and between behavior and the rest of the human body. So this is really quite something. This is a person who has absolute self-control. Lehachtiom uletamom chas v'shalom. The Beinoni is so vigilant to ensure that none of that theoretical negative energy, theoretical temptation, can ever actually manifest, so as to lehachtiom, to cause them to transgress, uletamom, or to allow them to become contaminated. And those go hand in hand, because the nature of doing something which is a transgression is that it contaminates the person, the body, the mind, the human, the soul. Everything kind of gets messed up when we do what we shouldn't do. Okay, so what does the Beinoni have? the Torah, in Tehillim, King David tells us that the principle is sur meirav asei toiv. You've got to stay away from the things that are negative, and then you've got to do the things that are positive. And that's effectively how the Alter Rebbe is describing the Beinoni over here. First, let's talk about how much avoidance of the negative the Beinoni is capable of. So he avoids negative thinking, he avoids negative speech, he avoids negative behavior. That's on that side, sur meira, steering clear of the things that you're not supposed to do. And on the positive side, rak, shloishe levushe nefesh oilikis, the three garments used by the nefesh elikis, the godly soul, heim levadom mislapshim beguf. They are the only parts of interface between soul and body that actually get through to the body. That means that the person is absolutely focused and fixated on the 613 mitzvahs. That's what the Beinoni thinks about. That's what the Beinoni speaks about. That's what the Beinoni does. Let's pause for a second before we go further. So if you met somebody like this, and I don't mean a casual interaction. You met somebody like this, you got to know them, you spent time with them, you watched how they interact with the world, where they've got this incredible mastery, that they're never falling into inappropriate behaviors, and they're always aligned with what Hashem wants, and they're only speaking words which the Torah would approve of, and they're only thinking things that Hashem would be proud of. You meet somebody like that, let's be honest, you're going to think you met a tzaddik. Obviously. Right? That's what you're going to think. Because somebody who has such a level of dedication, somebody who has such a level of focus, how can they not be a tzaddik? Has to be a tzaddik. Surely. So this is yet another bombshell in the bombshells we've learnt in Tanya. Before we opened this book, life was simple. Anybody I liked was a tzaddik. Anybody I didn't like was a rasha. And I was a Beinoni. That's pretty much the simplistic view of life that we had before Tanya. Now we've destroyed all of our perceptions. I am a rasha, hopefully on the upper end of the rasha spectrum, because we've seen how broad that spectrum could be. And if I'm really honest with myself, I'm probably not a gold card rasha either. Yeah, maybe silver. Tzaddik, well, we have actually no idea what a tzaddik is, other than the fact that the tzaddik, the perfect tzaddik, we could identify, because the perfect tzaddik is an individual who is changing the world and is not willing to rest until the world is a holier place, so that makes it a little bit easier to define who that perfect tzaddik is. The imperfect tzaddik and the Beinoni, I don't know how you're supposed to tell the difference. How are you supposed to tell the difference? You don't know what's going on internally. We only have the capacity to judge people based on our interaction with them, based on what they're showing outward. So I don't know what the person's like inside. Are they a tzaddik inside, which is somebody who's completely quelled any negativity, or are they a Beinoni inside who just has self-mastery? And quite frankly, I'm not even sure I know what the difference between those two things means. What's the difference between controlling or subduing the negative and having self-mastery? Is it not just semantics? It's not just two different ways of describing the same thing. In fact, if you have a look in certain other works besides Tanya, the word here that the Alter Rebbe uses for Beinoni is the word that others would call tzaddik. So this gets really confusing now. As I say, the rasha is fairly easy to identify. Anybody who's doing something that is not approved by Judaism, in that moment they are rasha, and they stay there until they do teshuvah. Perfect tzaddik is so rare we probably won't encounter it, and if we do, it will be fairly easy to identify, because this is somebody who is driven with an otherworldly mission to make a difference in our lives and in the whole world. And the Beinoni, I don't know, how do you find a Beinoni? You meet a Beinoni, you think, they're a tzaddik. They never say anything wrong, they never do anything wrong, they never think anything wrong. So we need to understand what exactly this Beinoni is. And before we do that, let's drop another bombshell. Veloy ovar avera miyamav. The definition of a Benoni is somebody who has never sinned, ever. Veloy ya'avor le'olam, and will never sin. Okay, so if you tell me that somebody has achieved such self-mastery that they will never sin, okay, I don't know how you can guarantee that, but it's plausible. Somebody who's reached such a level of mastery, makes sense. They're going to stick with that for the rest of their life. And they've obviously invested a lot of time and effort, and they've grown, and it's stuck. It's become their habit, or it's become their reality. But loy ovar avera miyamav, if you tell me that the definition of a Benoni is somebody who has never sinned, there go my aspirations. Isn't the whole premise over here that we're supposed to aspire to be a Benoni? But if a Benoni has never sinned, how could anybody aspire to be a Benoni? By definition, surely. So we've got to pause here for a moment and try and understand what that means. Lo ovar avera miyamav, a person who has never sinned. How do you never sin retroactively? And maybe just to add another layer to this, just for color, if that's true, that a Benoni is somebody who has never sinned, then it goes without saying that a tzaddik has never sinned. How then do we deal with some of the stories that we know in our history about very, very great people who didn't have a great start to their lives? So let's just pull out one example which is relevant at this time of the year, Rabbi Akiva. So for 40 years, Rabbi Akiva knows absolutely nothing substantial about Judaism. Nothing. Can't read. Not only does he not... Okay, so you could say here's a person who's an ignorant person, and guess what? There are ignorant people who are very pious people. That does happen. But Rabbi Akiva had a bit of an issue with Torah scholars. And he used to have an aggressive saying that he would use, bring me a Torah scholar and I'll deal with him. And he did not mean business-wise. So how do you go from that to becoming Rabbi Akiva? The Rabbi Akiva, arguably the most famous rabbi of his time. Not when I say his time, not just his generation. The whole Mishnah period. Challenge somebody, how many rabbis from the Mishnah period could you name? And there's a very good chance the first name that comes out is Rabbi Akiva, and in many cases, for many people, the last name as well. Rabbi Akiva, we're told the entire structure of the Talmud is built on his principles that he shared with his students. But if a Benoni has never sinned, and so certainly a tzaddik has never sinned, how do people get to become a Benoni, or for that matter, get to be a tzaddik? So the easy answer, and it is the correct answer, as you've pointed out, is teshuvah. Right? And if we were to make a top 10 abused words in the Jewish language, teshuvah is probably one of them. And tzaddik is probably another, by the way. But teshuvah, why? Because I don't think we really appreciate what teshuvah actually looks like. We've all, our whole lives, grown up knowing that there's certain times of the year that are teshuvah season, right? Right now we're in the safe zone, but in a few months' time we start entering teshuvah season again, and then you've got Elul, and you've got Rosh Hashanah and the 10 days of teshuvah, and then Yom Kippur, and then you think it's over, but then they throw Hoshana Rabbah at you, and you realize it's not over. And when it comes to teshuvah season, maybe because we've grown up just observing people around us, I don't know if that's where it comes from, but for many people the perception of teshuvah is just fess up. Say what you did wrong. Bang your chest, hopefully hard enough that 3 rows down in the shul they can hear you. Because if you bang hard enough, then Hashem must obviously forgive you. And if you are really, really good at teshuvah, you'll even squeeze out a few tears. Voila, there you are. That's teshuvah. Only it's not. Only it's really not. So what is teshuvah? The Rambam tells us that the essence of teshuvah is to regret what we've done with such intensity that we know we'll never do it again. In fact, the Rambam uses slightly different language. He says, we regret it with such intensity that Yodea Ta'lumois, God, who knows the secrets of what's really going on inside a person's mind and heart, can attest to the fact that we'll never do it again. So what does that look like? Here's an example. I don't know, I'm not casting aspersions on anybody and their al-khayt, but I once heard about a person who was doing al-khayt on Yom Kippur, and they got to a certain line in the al-khayt, and they thought, you know what, I know I'm supposed to say over here al-khayt that I feel so terrible, I'm so sorry for what I did. Truth of the matter is, now that I think about it, it was actually a really nice experience. And it's unfortunate that it's forbidden according to Judaism. But you know what? It's Yom Kippur, so al-khayt. I'll say the al-khayt. And effectively the person is thinking, although they would never verbalize it, that the likelihood is by next year, this time, I'll still have that on my list. So that's not really what teshuvah is, right? Teshuvah is not just feeling bad. It doesn't help to just feel bad. So what is teshuvah? We're taught, the Gemara tells us that you could basically divide teshuvah into two groups. There is teshuvah out of fear, and there's teshuvah out of love. And what we're told is that when a person does the more advanced kind of teshuvah, which is out of love, it completely reconstitutes the behavior. So what does that mean, reconstitutes the behavior? Let's think of it this way. Imagine you have two friends who've been lifelong friends. They've been through school together, they went to university together, they were friendly when they were dating, they were friendly once they got married, they spent social time together, and then, as is customary, they have a faribel, they have a fallout. And they don't talk for 3 years, which, by the way, by Jewish standards is not long. So they don't speak for 3 years. And then at some point, one of them has the maturity to go over to the other and say, hang on a second, we were lifelong friends, we have so many shared experiences, we actually really get along, we really like each other, we care about each other, let's deal with this. And they sit down and they have one of those frank conversations which lasts for a few hours, and they talk about all the stuff and the misunderstandings and whatever, and they come to the conclusion afterwards that the faribel is now officially over, and we're burying the hatchet, and we're burying it 6 feet under, so we're really burying the hatchet, and we're good. One of two things is going to happen now. If that was not a genuine experience, for the rest of their relationship, they're going to feel the scar tissue. For the rest of their relationship, they're going to remember that there was that period of 3 years where things weren't good, and they're always going to be on guard what happens if that happens again. But if their process of reconciliation was deep and meaningful and fueled by their love for each other, by their care for each other, then what's going to happen is they're going to emerge with a deeper relationship than what they ever had. Because that ability to go through something which is so destructive and come out on the other side with renewed commitment to each other, to the relationship, means that you now have a whole different, deeper relationship to what you had before. Turns out, the faribel was the best thing that ever happened to us. If not for that faribel, we would never have this depth of relationship that we have now. That's the higher type of teshuvah. That means a person does something which they shouldn't have done. I don't know, pick your... I feel like we could make al-khayt into a deck of cards, and then you could just say, pick your al-khayt, any al-khayt, you know? So pick an al-khayt, pick something that we've done wrong, that we had to do teshuvah for. There are two kinds of teshuvah. There's one kind of teshuvah that says, oy vey, I did something wrong, and that's really bad, and I've ruined the relationship between myself and Hashem, and maybe there'll be consequences for that. So unfortunately, we've got to patch this up because it's not practical to continue this way. And that could be somebody who never does the Aveira ever again, but that's because they're patching it up because there's this onus of responsibility that I've got to fix our relationship. Or you could have somebody who's got this awakening that says, oh my, how did I allow so much time or energy to pass running in the opposite direction of where my life is supposed to go? How did I let that happen? And now I've got to play catch up. In which case, it turns out that the faribel is the cause of the deeper relationship. The transgression is the cause of my mature connection to Hashem. The reason I'm learning more now is because of what I feel I was missing. The reason I'm more vigilant now about Shabbos is because of that time that I went through a patch that I was resentful about Shabbos and I gave it up. Any situation where the cause of my growth and the strength of my commitment is the recovery from the thing that I did wrong, then the thing I did wrong is no longer constituted as an Aveira. It is now designated as a growth point. It is now designated as a catalyst. Because without that catalyst, I wouldn't be moving at the warp speed that I'm moving now. Or I wouldn't be invested with the depth that I'm invested now. When we say that a Beinoni is somebody, lo ovar avera mi yamav, who has never sinned in his life, that's not an historical record. Maybe there was a time that this person was actually well off the rails. Maybe there was a time that this person was completely spiritually detached. But that is no longer relevant, not because somebody in the courts expunged their record, not because Hashem is so forgiving that he said, it's fine, we'll wipe the slate clean, one big massive Yom Kippur experience. It's because the Aveira is no longer an Aveira. And you know where we could relate to this, by the way? You could relate to it in something like a serum, for snake venom. So somebody, God forbid, is bitten by a snake. We rush them off to the hospital. What do we do to the body? We introduce the serum into the body. Where did the serum come from? Venom. So what do they do? Do they have it labeled in the wherever it is that the cabinet where they keep all these anti-venoms? Do they have it labeled as venom? No, they have it labeled as anti-venom, even though it was once venom. Because it's been completely reconstituted now. It no longer constitutes a threat. It no longer is a spot, a blot, a mark, a stain. That's what the Beinoni has done. The Beinoni, in order to become a Beinoni, had a past. By definition, you are not born a Beinoni. You cannot be born a Beinoni. A Beinoni is a conscious decision. A Beinoni is hard work. A Beinoni is focused investment. It doesn't come naturally. By definition, a Beinoni has a history. And in order to become a Beinoni, the Beinoni doesn't just hide the history or delete the history or ignore the history. The Beinoni uses the history. And that redefines it, that it is no longer part of what was, it's part of what is. It is no longer an abstraction, it is now experience. That's the strength of this Beinoni, never having sinned. Okay, please God, next week we'll continue with more of the insight into how the Beinoni operates, probably by revisiting first the part that says, and will never sin, because we haven't really unpack that fully yet.